Welcome to Attic Static. Today we have two stories for you, The Extra Seat and The Watcher of Rig 42. Sit down, relax, and enjoy. The Extra Seat. I have spent 3 years pretending that I am a normal person who simply enjoys the quiet. But tonight, standing in the center of the whispering harvest corn maze just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lie finally crumbled. I had to admit it. It started when I entered the maze. The air was heavy with the scent of dry husks and damp earth. To any observer, if there were any, I would have looked like a solitary walker, my boots crunching rhythmically against the dirt path. But as the shadows lengthened, I felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the wind rustling the corn leaves, it was the sensation of weight. About 10 minutes into the maze, I noticed him. He wasn't standing next to me, and he wasn't hidden behind a stalk. He was simply there. A man in a charcoal gray overcoat, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He walked exactly 3 paces behind my left shoulder. At first, I tried to ignore him. I told myself it was just the solitude of the maze playing tricks on my mind. But then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic hum that didn't belong to me. It was a low, melodic vibration that seemed to emanate from the space between my shoulder blade and his chest. When I turned my head slightly, I could see the hem of his coat swaying, even though there was no breeze in that specific corridor. As I moved deeper into the maze, the passenger became more distinct. He wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. He didn't float or flicker. He had mass. He had presence. When I walked quickly, he quickened his pace. When I stopped to catch my breath, he stood perfectly still, his chin tilted slightly as if observing something just above my head. The middle of the maze was where the tension began to tighten like a physical knot in my chest. The corn stalks grew taller here, their yellowed leaves creating a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. I started to feel his proximity more intensely. It wasn't just visual anymore, it was thermal. A faint, cool draft followed him wherever he moved. I tried to speak to him. "Hello," I whispered into the labyrinth. He didn't answer with words, but as if in response, he reached out a gloved hand and briefly brushed the tip of my ear. It was a fleeting touch, like the ghost of Icarus, yet it sent a shiver down my spine that made my teeth ache. I realized then that while everyone else would see me walking alone, to him, we were a pair, a traveler and his silent shadow. Then came the turn into the spiral of size. This was where the maze narrowed until the stalks pressed against my ribs. The passenger moved closer. He wasn't 3 paces behind anymore. He was right beside me, his shoulder occasionally bumping mine. I could see the texture of his coat now, thick wool, slightly frayed at the cuffs. His face remained a mystery of shadows, but his eyes, 2 pinpricks of pale, silver light, seemed to glow with a quiet intelligence. I began to panic. Why was he only visible to me? I reached out my right hand and felt nothing but empty air. To a bird flying overhead or a farmer standing at the entrance, there was only one person in this corridor. But for me, the world was crowded by his silent company. He wasn't a haunting of the location, he was a haunting of my perspective. As we reached the final stretch toward the exit, the hum became a steady, comforting drone. The fear began to melt into a strange sense of companionship. I realized that for 3 years, since this first day in the maze, he had been following me, not just here, but everywhere. He was there when I sat at my desk, though no one saw him sitting in the chair opposite me. He was there when I slept, standing by the foot of my bed. But tonight, in the closing moments of the maze, he did something he had never done before. He stopped moving independently. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against mine for a single, deliberate second. In that moment, the silver light in his eyes flared bright, and I felt a sudden, profound sense of completion. He didn't vanish into thin air. Instead, he took one final step forward, merging into my own shadow. The weight on my left side disappeared, but the warmth remained. I walked out of the maze into the moonlight, no longer just a person walking through the corn. I was a person who finally acknowledged their constant companion. I stood at the gate and turned back to look at the towering stalks. He was gone from my sight, but he hadn't left me. He had settled into the very fabric of my being. I took a deep breath, the scent of corn still lingering in my hair, and finally admitted the truth. I am never truly alone. The passenger has simply found his permanent home within me. And now, our next story. The Watcher of Rig 42. Scene 1. The hum of the ocean is a constant companion. I live on Rig 42, a skeletal steel giant anchored in the midnight zone of the Atlantic. My cabin is small, smelling of salt and industrial grease, but it feels like home. Outside, the water is a heavy, pressurized velvet, pressing against the thick glass of my porthole. Most people think the ocean floor is silent, but it isn't. It vibrates. It's a low-frequency thrum that settles in your teeth. Scene 2. I met him on the third week of my shift. He lives in cabin 14, just 3 doors down from mine. At first, I didn't notice him because he was so still. While most crew members sleep in cycles, he seems to exist in a state of permanent wakefulness. When I finally peered into his doorway during the midnight watch, I saw him sitting on a wooden stool, facing his window with his hands folded over his knees. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even blinking. He was just looking. Scene 3. The next day, the feeling of being observed began to itch at the back of my neck. I would be reading or repairing a valve, and I'd suddenly feel a weight in the air, the sensation of eyes tracing my movements. I'd look toward cabin 14, and there he would be. He never leaves his stool. He doesn't eat much, he barely speaks, but he is always awake. He is the neighbor who never sleeps. Scene 4. The strangeness escalated on day 10. I noticed that whenever I was in my cabin, he wasn't just looking at the window, he was looking at me. Every time I caught his gaze, his eyes were wide, dark pupils fixed on my face like a hawk on a field mouse. One night, while I was drifting off, I felt a faint rhythmic tapping against my glass. Asterisk tap, tap tap, tap, asterisk. It wasn't the tide. It was deliberate. Scene 5. I decided to confront him. I pushed open his door and stepped into his small, dim space. The air inside was colder than in mine. He didn't jump. He didn't turn his head quickly. He simply tilted his chin up a fraction of an inch. "You're awake," he whispered. His voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I told him how much it bothered me, the feeling of being watched all day. He smiled, a thin, pale thing. "I am not watching the window," he said. "I am watching you wait for the window to change." Scene 6. That night, the ocean turned violent. A storm rolled in, making the rig groan and sway like a ship in a fever dream. The pressure outside was immense. I lay in my bunk, but sleep wouldn't come because of the Watcher. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faint scritch of his fingernails against his window pane. It sounded as if he were trying to peel back the glass itself. Scene 7. On day 20, the fog rolled in a thick, gray soup that swallowed the rig's lights. Visibility was near zero. I woke up at 3 a.m. to find my own porthole covered in frost. From inside his cabin, a muffled sound emerged. It wasn't tapping anymore. It was a low, melodic humming, perfectly steady. Asterisk Asterisk. It sounded like he was trying to lull something to sleep. Scene 8. Panic finally seized me. I sat up and looked at my window. A shadow moved against the glass from the outside. For a second, I thought it was a fish or a piece of debris. But then, a hand appeared, a long, pale hand with too many knuckles, pressing against the exterior of my glass. It didn't belong to a human in the water. It belonged to something lurking just inches away. Then another hand appeared next to it. And another. Scene 9. I scrambled out of my bunk and stood before the porthole. The pressure was making the glass creak. Suddenly, the door to cabin 14 swung wide open with a violent bang. My neighbor stood there, but he looked different. His hair was matted, his skin was translucent, and his eyes were shimmering like whetstones. He pointed at my window. "It's tired of watching you from inside," he whispered. At that moment, the pressure became unbearable. The glass didn't just crack, it shattered inward in a spray of diamonds. Scene 10. A creature, not a fish, but something sleek and multi-limbed with skin like polished obsidian, pushed through the broken glass. It had been waiting for my neighbor to invite it in. The creature landed on the floor, its tail sweeping aside my books. It blinked at me once, then let out a soft sigh of relief. My neighbor smiled, his job finally finished. He sat back down on his stool and closed his eyes for the first time in 20 days, falling into a deep, peaceful sleep while the creature settled into my chair, ready to watch me from the inside. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories and make sure to like.